Greetings, all. So, I'm here with you to talk a little bit about what we have in our interesting finds. During a visit to NARA, which is the National Archives and Records Administration, and I actually was researching something else that had to do with Civil War period. I was looking at correspondence between different um, companies and captains or colonels, and sometimes the Secretary of War, sometimes other agencies that dealt with the organization. Um, and what I found was this document in the most obscured place, like I just didn't understand why I was finding it here and if that was a misfile. So I'm in a section that is dated probably 1864, 1865. And I had been, for the most part of my time, just going and reading through one letter after another letter in the most exquisite cursive writing you could find. And I am being facetious with that, but the idea is just the opportunity to, if I had stopped and said, you know what, let's let this go, I would not have found this. Or if I had just said, no, I didn't find what I was looking for. I've just been making it a rule for me to follow all the way through, even if it's not the pile of a folder that I feel connects with there's some type of information in here for this period. And so it speaks volumes to the idea of understanding elements that may not be directly in your research. And so I thought this was an interesting find. In this lone folder, the last folder, and there were about, this was like box one of two. So the first box had about seven folders. This had two, and I'm looking at the very last one. And in this last one, there was a deposition. And usually depositions you find filed in with court records. It has a case number sometimes, or it it's identified by who um, is the one filing the complaint and who is the defending their selves against this complaint. And so there's some other technical terms that are used for those positions, um, more so in the um, period of the 17 and 1800s. So they had different language for that. But that's neither here or there. Let's get back to what is on the screen right now. And so what I have on the screen is really um, an excerpt from the deposition. And so this is why this is such a powerful, cool find. And powerful in that depositions are one thing, but depositions of when you find that, if you look at this, and so I'm gonna go right into it so I don't belabor this process, but the idea is this is the backstory, and I'm still unfolding it because this is a case, this deposition is not filed with other parts of the case. I'm kind of piecing it together based upon the kinds of questions that were asked, and there was some summary paragraph. But usually, what happens in these cases, what I would say is you could probably find this deposition in another file folder, because what I found looking at many court cases from 1700s and 1800s alike is they literally hand wrote. If you needed a copy of something, they hand wrote another copy. So sometimes you'll find it's like, I read this already, for word. And so they would have handwritten, this might be the original, there might be another copy and another copy. There sometimes where there's some type of printed or like some like they put it through some type of press that allowed it to um be copied, but very few times have I seen that. And so inside of this particular um story here, we're looking at a situation where the person that's being called as a witness in this case. And I believe, based upon the questioning, there's a lieutenant named W.W. Grace. Lieutenant Grace is how he's referenced. And inside of this case, he's being accused of withholding the money of other. And I'm still not sure what to call them, but all of the witnesses that attest or made some testimony toward this lieutenant withholding their money spoke of their affiliation with the military. It's during the period, like they give that indication. And so I'm also thinking that this lieutenant was affiliated perhaps with this group of men who were serving their time um, in the military. And so what happens is this is the name of the person, John G. Smith, and he's identified as being colored. All right. So you'll learn a little bit more about what colored means in the scope of his questioning because depositions. Listen, if you've ever read a pension file that's similar to some type of, you've seen witness depositions in court cases, they can get pretty gritty. And in a case where an someone of color that might be African American could possibly have more scrutiny and more scrutinizing questions. And so the first one helps us as a researcher. The first question that's given by the recorder, what is your age and trying to get my little smart. What is your age, residence, and business? Oh my goodness, what is this? Let me remove that. That was weird. Um, so essentially, they're asking what is this person's affiliation with the matter at hand. But you get some information about their age, when they were born, and where they're coming from. And so that helps us because um, I'm not going into a lot of details with this video, but there were other witnesses, and sometimes they'll label them as being colored. And then I've seen places such as South America, that they're from South America and they're here. And so to also add another layer to this case has to do with all of the people that are being questioned were signed up or for the military in the state of Maine, right? Maine, right? But what you'll, and it's, it gives some actual insight into how things were moving. First of all, as an African American in Maine, that is considered a port city. And how are they? And then all the people that were interviewed, from what I've seen in this short excerpt, they were not born in Maine. So they came from somewhere to Maine. And sometimes they were given different rendezvous points for getting people, drafting people, and then sending them to where they needed to go. So here we are. John C. Smith. So he answers, and it's written that he's 37 years old, and he resides, that not where he's born, but where he resides. So we don't know that information, but he's currently in Elmira, New York. So for me, I probably go to the census and check out what he's doing. And they said he's working as a waiter. Just putting it there. Very, very important information, wouldn't you say? So this is why we actually really pay attention to resources. So there was no file. You could have actually seen a John G. Smith on a record that may describe his complexion as light brown, black, brown eyes, black hair. And you would not be able to definitively say that he was African American just based upon the way things are classified. You may have seen that he was born in some town near or around New York. Who knows? And you still would not have been able to definitively say he is African American. So we have some information here. And we may not actually be able to say that all the way, but there's a good chance that he is. Looking at his name, his residence, and his age, we're keeping those in mind. The second thing they start and they ask him, have you been, were you recently in the service? And that goes toward this entire case, because this is, I have no idea why it's doing that, but let's just use another tool. So yes, so this they're looking at this in terms of have you been in the service? And he answers, yes, I enlisted as a recruit in Lewiston, Maine. So he enlisted there. And then, and many of them, they enlisted a few months prior to. So he was the longest serving one that I saw in this particular witness, but February last. So, and many of them were just there for often 6 months or less, were they in this particular area or summoned for this. And then they said they mustered out in May of 1865. So there's some things that helps us date and understand what kind of records may be around for them and where to look for them. So that's an information that you would not necessarily get. And like I said, this case did not name these witnesses on the front page, right? It's probably not even filed under their name. And if so, John Smith, it does not ring a bell like, oh, African American. This is simply you looking page through page and finding this person exists here. So that was a pretty cool find. And then I would do a different video to kind of go into detail about the details of this regimen and what they are about and all those kinds of things. And perhaps gain some more insight. But you're getting a sense of who John G. Smith was or what he was doing in this part of his life. Was, you can start to infer, and you want to learn a little bit more. Is he married? Does he have a family elsewhere? So those are things that may come up. So Lieutenant Grace is the one that's being accused. And so they go in to talk about that. But as you go, they talk about the money exchange. And it's really interesting. So as they talk about the money exchange here, it's like they allowed this money to be held by this lieutenant. So many of us now, it's like, no, if it's my money, give it to me right now. I'll keep good tight. But they were like, I'll hold on to it for safekeeping, That was and sometimes they didn't know them very well at all. It was just like, okay. So there's some location names in here too. Camp Berry at Portland, Maine. They say he resides at Lewiston, Maine. It's good to try to map out even those small differences within the same state. Think about where those places are. Because as we start to learn a little bit more about what branch of the military he might have been affiliated with, he could have had some experience with seamen. And so you may or may not know, but as I'm learning and studying, is this that there's so much to be said. Now, this is around 1865, where the Army side of the military branch of the military would be um, it's somewhat segregated, but it's still allowing African Americans to be a part of the Army. But in the Navy side, they actually weren't segregated until the early 1900s, right? So it's kind of a weird history there. And so inside of that, what you found was the Army often took many people um, slowly but surely. But often the people that joined the Army weren't as skilled. They had to be trained on certain things and how to do this with the musket, how to do that with the canning. All these different things had to be learned. But when you think about the naval side of things, many of our African American ancestors and other people from the African diaspora, they were very experienced seamen prior to any type of military affiliation. So often the training time was much less, and it was easier to, it was less training that was needed to get them ready and set up. And they were literally, sometimes you'll find more, and you have to look, more people, um, African Americans that may have had higher ranking positions in the Navy early on. So that's neither here nor there. Let's go a little bit further into so some of the other things that we found as we go into this. So here's another person, another witness that showed up in our deposition, right? So they're interviewing different people that have dealt with this lieutenant. And here we have John Alden, and they say he's colored. And so, of course, they asked that initial question, how old you were ready for. So he says he lives in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And I think that's very telling about this kind of thing. So first of all, during that time, like I'm almost certain they were probably going from one boat to another to get across to these different places. But they're going from one port city to another port city, Maine to New Bedford. That's not a far stretch. Um, and he works on a farm. How cool is that? Um, in terms of like just, it's just what it is. You find a lot of people when they list their occupation, list as farmers, but they do so much more. Um, and so he talks about his time and how he's affiliated with them. So he goes into that he was enlisted in Portland, Maine. And then he mustered out um um and he was only there about 3 months. So like I said, many of the people that are here are speaking of their work. And I would really like to know what came of this case, right? But because it's not in its filed with the rest of the case, and not many are. Sometimes they're different here, but this may just be a copy of it. Um, and so they talk about the money and how they let this gentleman hold it, and they would come by and ask, "Do you by any chance have my money?" Okay, not today. Okay, and they'll come back. I was like, the patience of Job. You know, it's like, how do I really trust you? So here we are. Here's another one. Um, I think I want to go into a little bit about, so at the bottom here, they start to interview for the next person. And then the next person is, so these are just all the names that come up that you might not have ever connected to. Simeon, I don't know, that might be a F. Gord, um, or Ford. Yeah, we know. And he's considered colored. And so we can look and find out what where he's from and his age and so on and so forth. So we're looking at, and many of these, this happened um through, and this is in a Massachusetts folder that's referenced in Maine. So many of the recruits sometimes were taken to these rendezvous points that were on the Harbor Islands in Massachusetts, and then sent wherever they needed to go. And so it's very interesting that all the people that have a grievance with this particular lieutenant, and he's a first lieutenant, W. Grace, of the 116th Regiment, New York. So, yeah, I'm kind of, there's a lot to be unpacked here, but the thing I want to drive home is just how important it is to just not be too closed off to just record titles, but what you might find inside of any record set can, in fact, be a gateway. And this isn't who I'm researching, but making note of it and sharing information is such a crucial and critical part of this process. So the last thing I want to share is um, the recording I did for just understanding a little bit more of the um, the actual document, where we start to look at how many gems I found on my trip. You know, there's just so much cool stuff that can be had. So let me get you to that page. So right after this deposition, I found this thing. Take a close look at what I found. Okay. All right. So I took a short video of it, just so that you could see the long form of it. So for right now, it's a muster and descriptive role of a detachment of men drafted and mustered. Let's move it down. Mustered into service of the United States by, I think his name is Hiram Rollins, um, for the 43rd Regiment of the United States Colored Troops. And this is kind of it's dated 1865, March 29th, 1865. Um, and one thing I want to come back to um, is that I'm going to go back this way so that we can see that what we see is the titles here. We're getting information about where they were. And this was just a folded up, old tatted paper that was in the back of a folder, random folder that really was just a communication. So usually it just has a lot of boring letters that they wrote back and forth. Send a report for this. How many people registered? And this was in the very last folder on the very last page of that folder. So we have first and last names of people, their rank, and all of them were, as they say, people of color, but many of them African American or of the African diaspora. And so we're thinking um, these, sometimes you can just go by the county and province as much, but if you look at where they are born, so not just where they're living, but where they're born, how cool is that? And so we have West Virginia. I've looked through this list, and so we can find more. West Virginia, um, and look at this one. It says Africa right here, Africa. How about that? Huh? That's where he was born. How about that? Um, and so we have his name, rank. And so these were somewhat like titles more than occupation, but there's some people who are identifying as seamen specifically, and then there are people who um, are laborers. And so what I'm not clear about is more information about the 43rd. So I want to learn a little bit more about that before I make any more assessments on the occupations. But they vary also. And there's another name that's folded in here. So the second person is also a seaman. Hard to see at this view, but you can kind of see when they were drafted. So you're getting a place of where they were born and then where they're drafted is not where they're born, essentially. So many of them, Portland, Maine, how are they getting to Maine? And what is that? And so my research centers on a certain southern region. And what I've learned somewhat, these port cities, they communicated a lot and they often had training sessions that went vice versa. So some from New England came to the South to train people on certain areas of whaling, different types of boat, and then vice versa. They were trying to watch many of the natives in these regions, how they were able to manage um, different types of shipping vessels and also the um, trading with them in different ways. So then the district within the state that they were, so it's very interesting to see that. And let's go a little bit further. Um, Let me delete that. And let's go a little further on the scroll. So what else can we find? All right, so they talk about what they look like, the description, of course. Um, and so this is very interesting. Like here, they'll say colored, 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 dark, colored. And so you want to pay attention to how they're addressing it in that way. For instance, um, and they had certain names. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the sixth row. So let's go back here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So they have them as colored. I was just curious about that. But as you go on, these kinds of things like dark, light, brown, black, they were also given to people who were would look white. Yes, so it was just designation that they saw themselves as having a dark complexion, but not necessarily that that means that they're dark from the standard of like Black or African American. And so here we are, we have clothing account, and some of these money, they had to pay for their own coat. That's why, what they were paid, they would not get a discount on what they were paid, but they were often paid less than what they were um, their white counterparts. And so the commencement of their service went, and then there's a little bit more, there's a little bit more. A little bit more. That's just one half. That's why I had to take a video because I just wanted to stretch it, see how it stretches all the way over. And so the second half of the paper starts to look a little bit closer at different remarks and comments meant, um, uh, and certain companies that they were assigned to. And so we have more information. Let me just make sure. And now this last part here, it says remarks, but it's written in and it's maybe a little bit difficult to see at this angle. But what I want to bring to your attention is that many of these men offer their service as substitutes. Right? So somebody who had the financial means could pay someone to work or be in their place instead of getting drafted and having to serve their time. And so these are the people, this is something that, and so what I want to say, this, which of these men from this regiment offer their service as a substitute? All of them. And this tells us that they played the role of substitute. And then who are they substituting for? And these are the people. And it's really interesting. I don't think many people take the time, and it depends on how your research resources are, but it would be interesting to see how who these people are that they're substituting for, and to see if there's any other connection that happens. And then they talk about the people, they were enrolled or they were drafted. And then once they are, it becomes another situation as they go a little bit further on. But this is just going to go a little bit closer in as we start to look more at the remarks side. They talk about and this is also a record of understanding how these people were paid. And they talk about what town these people were coming from. So many of them were living in Maine. And so these people were coming from different parts of the country and serving as substitutes for the citizens, the residents of Maine. And that was how that was done. So these are gems. So outside of just doing that work, I think it's really cool to take a closer look at, I'm trying to get closer to the documents. It's a little blurry here, but let's get into the actual names, right? And how we are getting to be able to see the names of the people that actually offer their service. And when you start to look at them, you're going to see areas for you to research. All right. So you find ancestors that you can't find anymore. What's happening? So this was cool. So I'm going to stop share and say, do due diligence and make sure you take a closer look at your records. Have a great rest of your night.